Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work. But producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
This week, we wanted to talk about loneliness. This is a topic that comes up a lot in my consulting room, and we've had a number of listeners who have requested this topic. So I personally have been wanting to do this because I feel like it's so important and looking forward to tossing this around this week.
So loneliness, to me, is a really multifaceted dynamic that probably touches on a couple of other things that we've discussed. I think that when people are feeling lonely, they can often have a sense of desperation, which is also mixed with a feeling of depression, which is also mixed with impatience and boredom and even self-depreciation. That I think what makes loneliness so complicated is that it's a kind of alchemical amalgam of numerous factors, including social opportunities. So as we're teasing loneliness out, I suspect we're going to really need to approach it in a circumambulation, looking at it as we walk around it from a number of different perspectives.
If I may, I just wanted to say that I think you're right that there's a lot of different pieces that go into loneliness, but I want to start right off by saying that contact with others is a basic human need. It's kind of up there with, food and shelter. And when you're spending your entire day, inside your house alone, then you're being deprived of a basic human need. So there is a way that there's lots of layers and there's lots of different ways it can manifest. But in some sense, it's a just so. This is something we need.
I'm thinking about Abraham Maslow, who did a very famous and fairly simple sort of pyramid-shaped chart. And right after the basic human need for physical safety, food, shelter, comes belonging. And it shows you that that is a primary need, a need for connection that is, I think, just part of what makes us human.
So if we start with that, the idea of being attached, or in terms of being lonely, being unattached. So even though we might have a core sense of needing to be in the orbit of a meaningful person, but if we have no spouse or no sexual partner, or if we've gone through a recent breakup, then that sets the stage for one of the reasons that loneliness can rise up, that unmet need.
I mean, I also think that, and they have done studies on this, and they've sort of broken it out, and there's this difference between social isolation and loneliness. And social isolation would be, you just don't really have anyone in your life. So there are these different kinds of ways that we need other people, and the lack of any of them can result in loneliness. So one of them might be, Joseph, the one you just mentioned, of having a spouse or a sexual partner or a person you're very, very intimate with, a family member that's in your life in a kind of daily way that you can really rely on. And then there's sort of having a network of people that you could call on when something goes wrong, just that sort of, maybe that's kind of community or belonging a little bit. And then there's even just another layer of sort of everyday contact with familiar people that, I mean, it could literally be that you go to the same coffee shop every morning and you exchange a few words with the person who makes your cappuccino, and he knows you and you know him, and you guys exchange a few words. At even that level of social contact can make a difference. So there's different kinds.
Yes, I think that what we're touching on is the issue of alienation, which is a little bit different from being unattached. That there are a lot of things that can provide or create that feeling of alienation, like you said, just having no close friends, or the familiarity of going to a coffee shop and having people just nod or not nod. And alienation has other dimensions, like, not being needed by anyone. Like, for instance, some people find pets can be an enormous resilience to loneliness, because, a dog needs you. I mean, it constantly needs you to provide for it and to be part of the pack.
I would change the word to the dog wants you. The dog is always welcoming. The dog is always glad to see you. The dog desires you, wants to be walked, petted, fed, but there is a sense of being wanted that I think is gigantically important from, its opposite of alienation. I'm disconnected, unwanted, unrecognized. The person in the coffee shop might say, "Oh, hi, good morning. You want your usual?" And the person can say, "Yes." It's a recognition of seeing oneself mirrored in another. And a pet can do that for you. That I see myself in another person's eyes. The face lights up, maybe just with the recognition that I'm a regular at the coffee shop, and hopefully with something, hopefully that's not all, and that there's something more. It goes back, I think, to that early sense of someone taking delight in you. The baby wakes up from the nap, and the mother leans over and says, "Hi, so, let's get you a clean diaper, and then let's see if we can find something for you to eat." It's just words, but the prosody, the tone of voice says, "I see you, I delight in you, I delight in talking to you, even though you're only 3 months old."
So in the loneliness, somehow that has been violated or interfered with. I mean, from a social standpoint, it could be literally the loss of another person or a pet, or some system that provides that mirroring and that closeness. But as psychoanalysts, I think we also see that complexes can alienate from that feeling of closeness. It's not uncommon for me to have someone say that, I'm surrounded by people at work who like me, I'm surrounded by cohorts or my family, and yet I feel totally alone.
Yeah.
So it can happen in a totally subjective realm, that whatever somebody is drinking in from all of that shining that happens back and forth is somehow blocked.
So I think that that's an interesting point, and I'm going to sort of stick in the slightly more concrete here for just a second, Joseph, but I think I'm pinging off your point, is that one of the things that happens when we're kind of lonely for an extended period of time is loneliness, like depression, distorts our view of the world, which of course, complexes do too, right? So when you're lonely, you start believing that you are maybe not worthy of being connected or not worthy of being liked. You start to doubt yourself. You start to anticipate that you'll be rejected. And it's sort of a whole body kind of process, right? That this is incredibly stressful and creates a lot of fear, I think. I mean, what I'm thinking of is that we're social animals. And if, when we were sort of evolving out on the savannah, if you were alone for any length of time, you were probably toast. And so I think, it's like if we don't feel connected to the group for an extended period of time, we get stressed, we get fearful. And that, as I was saying before, kind of prods us to react very defensively, perhaps, or to kind of isolate further because we're having a kind of visceral fear-based response. And so in a way, the very things that you need to do when you are lonely become harder to do because of the distortion of being lonely.
It's a kind of vicious cycle.
Yes.
I'm thinking here too about depression, and that when a person is depressed, that is, a time when the person may say, I go to work and I know people like me and I'm in a book club and something else, but, I'm still just really lonely. And that there's an internal condition that is making it hard for the person to feel connected with other people, even if he or she has many, seemingly and believably caring people around him or her.
Yes, I think we can imagine that the atmosphere of depression inside of us feeds into the self-depreciation you were talking about, Lisa, where people feel unattractive or stupid or ashamed in some fashion.
Right.
And also reinforces the idea that they're somehow different or they're being misunderstood or nobody needs them, that these tendrils support these different belief structures that bring people to this conclusion that they're all alone and they're in need of something. But the difference between depression and loneliness, when I think about it, is having seen really paralyzingly depressed clients, I don't always hear that they're lonely. I don't hear the desperation that loneliness includes when somebody is only depressed.
Wow. So say more about that.
Well, I think that many people who are in a deep, really terrible depression, they're not really desperate for another person, that they are deeply motivated to isolate. And the vortex of energy is spinning down to an internal place. It doesn't seem to be pinging like sonar out into the environment to see if anybody will respond to them. Well, I think with loneliness, there is a depressive core, but there is this sense of kind of ringing in these kind of concentric rings of need that are coming out from the person, hoping that somebody will notice or respond to them. That feels different to me.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. There's a different feeling tone to an isolation and a lack of energy to reach out versus that quality of bereftness and desperation that loneliness can engender.
And in order to say that one is lonely, there has to be a knowledge that they are lonely for someone, that there is an object which they believe, at least, could resolve it. When people are depressed, people aren't depressed for someone, right? It's not reaching for an outer object necessarily at the center of the depression. So loneliness knows it's reaching for people, albeit perhaps not doing it well or effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think they often kind of get wrapped up together, and they probably can sort of cause each other too. I mean, I think when you're really lonely, it's easy to get depressed, and when you're depressed, you're probably more likely to get lonely because you're isolating. So, but I see your point that there are sort of two distinct phenomenon. I would agree with that.
Or really that there's an amalgam is the feeling I'm having. is that depression is its own kind of ingredient. And I find myself going to the idea of desperation, which is this kind of grasping, panicky, helpless, afraid, abandoned kind of feeling, which
with
mixes,
loneliness.
which mixes in with the
Uh-huh.
depression.
The word that comes up for me around loneliness is longing.
Mm.
The
Yes.
person is longing, yearning for an other. And not only an other as a person or persons, but a sense of a felt connection of, oh, now it happened between me and whoever the other person might be. That there has to be a feeling of connection as well as presence. And that the longing can be activating. We long for all kinds of things, and it can inspire us to go out and seek them. There's something is missing.
If we're not too demoralized by the
Yes.
feelings of loneliness. I mean, one of the reasons that I kind of sort of stick with that frame a little bit is that this is something that a lot of people bring into my consulting room, where people are no longer married for one reason or another, and it can become increasingly difficult to feel connected with people and make new friends as we get older. Maybe the kids are grown and gone, and there's a real lack of connection. There's a real lack sometimes of merely any interaction with anyone. It's sort of that, it's almost like coming to see me is one of the major ways that they connect with someone during the week. And, there's a way that sometimes it's really concrete. It's like, we need to figure out how you're going to do something that's going to make you at least a little bit more connected with someone.
Exactly. So part of what brings it into the consulting room is that how they're reacting towards their loneliness is or isn't particularly successful or adaptive.
Right.
So if somebody comes in a chronic state of loneliness, both their internal response as well as their psychosocial response, something isn't working to relieve it. And some of that can be circumstantial, and some of it can be, for instance, passivity.
Yeah, or as you said before, Joseph, too, I think that we do have life patterns that may make it difficult for us to reach outside of our cozy cocoon. We may have difficulty trusting that we will be met if we reach out for more connection.
All that anxiety, that perhaps, again, coming to this idea of self-depreciation, that if somebody has a tremendously critical feeling about themselves, it might be hard to muster a feeling that anybody would want to respond to them. And so that pulls them back into a shell.
So I think we're talking about what the internal defenses or complexes or blocks might be that could assuage some of the loneliness and the sense of alienation. And that is what people can find in the consulting room, is an awareness of what is behind the loneliness, what has contributed to it. How can you and how can we together understand better what this is about for you? Are there underlying feelings of unworthiness, for example? Has there been a significant loss in your life of a significant other, let's say? And I think part of the process is that we reestablish a sense of connection, and that a sense of connection is possible with our conversations with people in therapeutic sessions. That there's still life, there's still possibility, a way to be seen, a way to be understood, and a way to understand yourself better.
Yes, and Deb, what I like about that is I think it carries with it the idea that the connection with the analyst could kind of become a base from which one might go on out into the world and look for other connections as well.
That's absolutely perfect. It's the reestablishment of an optimistic and hopeful base of the experience of I am seen and I am understood, And I can build on that now. It's kind of like creating an island in the midst of a vast body of water. Okay, there's some dry land. Okay, great. I can shake myself off and feel warmed by the sun. And then that island can somehow just be enlarged or enlarge itself.
I heard someone say the other day that in conditions of sort of safety, that our psyche kind of reorganizes itself.
Mm.
And I thought, yeah, that's just exactly right. There's no procedure, but if we create the right relational environment, that something can happen.
I think it also is a kind of repeat of what happens in our very earliest days. That we have to be seen by another. We have to be brought into life by another. An infant needs voice and holding and caring and all of the things that are provided by nurturing others. And in therapy, it's also very much at a higher stage of development, of course, but a repetition of, I see you and I care about you. I find you compelling and interesting and worthy, not because, like a baby, the baby hasn't earned it. It is just given and it is there. It's a kind of grace, really. But we have to be seen by another before we can really build more of a relationship with ourselves and with other people in our world. I think the relationship part of it is foundational.
You know, you were talking about the importance of being seen, and I'm remembering this particular episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if anyone ever watched that whole show. But I thought it was so brilliant because, as I recall, the kids who weren't popular, who didn't get a lot of attention paid to them, who weren't noticed very often, just started disappearing. And I think that, when you're very, very lonely, you almost feel invisible. You feel sort of disembodied.
And I would say that one of the core qualities, since we've moved on to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, of vampires, one of my favorite symbols, is that they are lonely.
Oh, God, yes, they
are so lonely. In some of the films, that they make friends with other vampires. But in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the vampire angel is desperately lonely, and it's Buffy who hangs in there with him and insists on seeing him and trusting him and not killing him, that humanizes him and brings him into connection and out of his terrible loneliness.
Yeah, you're right. The vampire is a great image for loneliness and isolation. I want to maybe come at this just a little bit of a different way, because that's kind of how we roll. Is what about can we talk about the sort of telos of loneliness? Jung was always interested not just in kind of where things had been in the psyche, but he was very interested in where things were going. And we continue to be interested in that in analysis. Sort of, is there a telos to loneliness? Could it be serving an important role, even if it's painful?
Well, what it brings up for me is the idea of neurotic isolation. When we are trapped in a kind of broken place in ourselves, and we find a painful way to adapt to that compromises us, but at least keeps us up and running. There's a way in which, as we limp through life, we don't want anybody mucking up the way that we are, because at least we're moving forward. And how we keep our defense mechanisms moving forward is that we cut ourselves off from anything that looks like it's going to interfere with that. So we kind of isolate ourselves with this secret, which is actually a kind of barely working, broken car, just belching, oil fumes and smoke out of its tailpipe, but at least you're moving a little bit forward.
You're talking about sort of a maladaptive coping mechanism or something.
Absolutely. So in that isolation, I think that a telos could be that the feeling of not wanting to be alone in our suffering gives us the energy to risk the neurotic isolation, risk disrupting our maladaptive behaviors in service to connecting to another person. So loneliness could actually drive us to be willing to give up something that isn't working well on a deeper level because of the hope that we would, in fact, be received and seen, as Deb has noticed.
And I'm thinking that drive to connect with others also entails a reconnection with feeling and a willingness to be a little bit vulnerable, or perhaps it's better to say authentic, and to be able to say to selected others, I'm having a hard time. I'd like to see more of you. To put ourselves out there rather than withdraw into this self-protective shell where we think we're protecting ourselves from being hurt, but we're also protecting ourselves from connection that could be refueling and enlivening.
So one of the things we do in analysis is the confession of our suffering. Whether we do that to the analyst, I suppose, or we even do it to a friend, begins to penetrate some of that defensive isolation.
Yeah, it's the way that desiring something leads us out of ourselves and into life and into connection. So even Deb used the word longing before. The longing is that which will, move us into life, really.
One of the other dimensions of loneliness that I think I'd like to bring up that I don't know if we've landed on is that there is a tremendous sense of malcontent in loneliness, which is different from some of the other amalgams. That what I notice in my own periods of loneliness in my life, which were very strong in my mid-20s, is that there's a tremendous desire to be somewhere else, and a certain kind of impatience and anger and uneasiness around what's happening inside of oneself. And I think that's a real element that could be put in service, as you were saying, to the telos, that there is a fire in loneliness, a kind of pacing frustration.
Joseph, that is so interesting because I can very much relate to that. And I'm thinking of some people that I've worked with that I think that would really fit. And that is maybe a particular quality of loneliness in the first half of life, where it's this kind of, it's this like that impatience and the anger and, when is it going to be my turn? And that those sort of feelings that really, that kind of light a fire under your butt and get you on the dating apps or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That it's like, and whenever I have a person in the first half of life who's in that place, one of the things I will say to them, and I mean it 100%, is that fire that you're talking about is good. Because there are people that are lonely and don't have the fire. And they are not as motivated to figure it out. And sometimes they don't, so that when it comes to the passivity.
Yes, exactly.
It's interesting that fire reminds me, of course, it maps onto the alchemical process of calcinatio.
Exactly.
And then it's the one that lives right next door to it, which is solutio. And that sometimes I think there is a profound grief in loneliness of the loss of connection, the loss of a significant other, terrible disappointment relationally can go in the other direction and be drowning, be flooding and sap energy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, I think that's what we were trying to put in is the idea of a kind of sad passivity, which can be that kind of cold, wet sponge feeling where people are lonely, but instead of getting on a dating app, they're crying or they're sleeping excessively or they're overeating or taking tranquilizers or smoking weed and
Right.
getting stoned. And that's that collapse into the coldness of it.
Yeah, of that list, Joseph, I would just say the crying, I think that is the solutio, and that could be
Mm.
a helpful thing to move through. Crying is really different than the other things you mentioned, obviously, because crying is about feeling our feelings, whereas the other things you mentioned are about numbing them.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be that you kind of have to pass through grief.
Mm-hmm.
I think people who are intensely lonely often do kind of go back and forth between fiery, hot, impatient anger and grief. I just wonder if a part of what I was wanting to explore and open up is it possible that loneliness in later life, say for the divorced woman in her 70s who spends almost all of her time alone,
Mm-hmm.
is that different than that, you're 31 and you're single and all of your friends are paired up? Is that a different is that kind of a qualitatively different animal?
Well, but if we categorize it as the experience of being unattached, which is perhaps even the loss of a spouse, is the loss of a spouse appreciably different from someone who doesn't have a spouse but longs for it? The longing for something we don't have and the loss of something that we used to have can both lead to loneliness.
Yeah, but to me it's more about sort of time frame, because I think
Mm-hmm.
the pacing quality that you were talking about, I do think there's a way that if you haven't numbed it out in your 20s and 30s, you realize, this is in Erickson's stages of development,
Mm-hmm.
whereas, damn it, I wish I had these memorized. I never can remember them, and so I'm looking it up as we speak. But what I was going to say is, if you kind of realize, gee, I'm not getting any younger here, that you do have this sense of a little bit of a sense of urgency. Whereas I think if you're toward, if you're in the later part of life, there's no sense of, gosh, I've got to figure this out. It's sort of, how do I come to terms with, where I am?
I'm thinking that this is the difference, or an illustration of the difference between the first and second halves of life, which was one of Jung's great contributions in his theory. And that the first half of life takes us out, or should take us out, into the world to do things and have experiences. And that may be part of the fire, that the agitation, frustration, the fiery loneliness that says, okay, I better get out there and meet some people. And in the second half of life, according to Jung, the need is to really connect at a deeper level internally with ourselves. And so the call may be to do maybe in a different direction when one is in 60s or 70s than 20s and 30s.
What I'm thinking is there's a kind of active solitude, a kind of fiery solitude that people can find. And we see this sometimes. Somebody retires and they're excited and they're going to take classes or exercise, take yoga classes, and they're going to read all these books that they haven't read before. And there is an expectation or an envisioning that they're going to be alone or in solitude when they do it, but the libido still flows to objects that are meaningful. So there's still some fire in the solitude versus the cold, like we said, the wet sponge passivity. It's such a different experience.
I think the wet sponge image is particularly vivid, by the way, but if one is in the second half of life, sure, there can be interest in new activities, and there can be interest in solitude, which can be fueling, restful, a wonderful experience. Solitude is very different from loneliness.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just go back because I found my Erickson reference here, and I think it's actually very appropriate to what we're talking about. So Erik Erikson was a psychologist who developed this way of understanding the human lifespan through some psychosocial stages, some crises that had to be met, and if they were resolved, then you sort of successfully completed that stage and went on to the next stage. And Erikson is interesting when we're talking about Jung, because Erikson was really one of the only other real kind of 20th century psychological thinkers who looked at what happened in terms of growth and development psychologically throughout the lifespan. A lot of other thinkers kind of focused really on what happened to our personality in early life and weren't so curious about what happened later. So in any case, Erickson says that in the years between 21 and 39 years of age, the psychosocial crisis that needs to be negotiated is intimacy versus isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the sense that, if Erickson's right, and I rather think he more or less is, that in those years, this is what we got to do. We got to figure out how to find intimacy. This is the task. And Deb, I think you're right that, kind of mapping Jung on here, the task in the second half of life is very different.
So let's sit with that for a minute. If I really like what you said, Lisa, and that really maps onto my kind of learning curve in my 20s. In retrospect, the idea that, as a kid, I didn't know much about intimacy or the needs of the soul. So there's a way in which I could be out at a club, teeming with people and still feel lonely because I didn't understand what was required of intimacy, what the price of passage was to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're going to look at the second half of life and the loneliness of second half of life, what is that process and what is required? What's the price of passage in the second half of life if it's not intimacy or learning intimacy?
Well, if I'm remembering Erickson correctly, and maybe if I'm not, correct me, Lisa, but doesn't he say that somewhere along the line one should become generative, a sense of having some basic sense of personal fulfillment, and that now there is interest and ability to extend oneself to others and in the world. People can do volunteer work, perhaps, enjoy grandchildren, and accept some of the losses
Right.
that are also an inevitable part of older years.
Yeah, Deb, I think you're right on there. His final stage, and I am cheating by looking at Google, is ego, ego integrity versus despair. And I think it is exactly that idea of sort of coming to terms with, and I mean, so for example, if we're going back to my hypothetical person, for example, a woman in her 70s who's divorced and the kids are grown and she's no longer works. And so there's a lot of time spent alone. I mean, one could be coming to terms with the losses and the vicissitudes and sort of feeling a sense of wholeness and integration about all of that and still be lonely.
Yes.
And that's going back to this idea that, hey, this is just a basic need. But Joseph, I want to hop back to your question that you asked a minute ago, because I think it was something that opens a door into another way of looking at loneliness, which is, a crucible for spiritual development. That the times in my life when I've been intensely lonely have been so painful. But there were times when I was really thrown back on myself and I had to reach into myself and be with myself and learn to rely on my own inner resources and be curious about those. So there's this way that it can be so difficult to tolerate. And yet in the darkness that is loneliness, there is something for us.
I agree. It's a painful process, but there are lots of religious and mythological examples which are ways of illustrating how important this is, that in our sense of loneliness and exile will come some help from another source. There are images of prophets that are sitting out in the desert and in a very dejected posture, or Jesus's 40 days in the wilderness. When all is lost, then something has to arrive that is beyond ego.
Yeah.
Loneliness can teach us that our egos are not all there is to us. We have to forsake ego and give up, in a sense, and see what may enter, see what may come. There is a spiritual component here.
It's learning to rely on the self in a way. And
Yes.
it's not really something you can learn, right? But it's almost like we look back and realize that we were being companioned during these times, even though in the moment it doesn't feel like it.
So we've been talking about the telos of loneliness and, the suffering of it, of course, that it feels like somebody is trapped at the bottom of a well and all the stones leading up to the light are covered with slick moss that you can't get a grip on. And we've talked about the idea that there can be a fire when we're young that can lead us to reaching out. In our elder years, we can reach out to spirituality and hope that something larger than ourselves will companion us and relieve us of the loneliness. But I'd like to also talk about when loneliness becomes a sickness, can become a kind of self devouring dragon and produce a kind of pathology. And where my mind is going is to the incel community. So there is an online subculture of predominantly white heterosexual men who have named themselves as involuntarily celibate, the incel community. And in these communities, there's a tremendous fostering of resentment and hate, and that flows then into other reservoirs of resentment where some of the young men may eventually find a partner or begin to move into partnership, and they will often be criticized and interfered with. And in some of these groups, that suffering, which is self-feeding, can rise up into racism, sexism, and even violence. The Southern Poverty Law Center had listed the incel movement and linked it with male white supremacist systems, that when that loneliness does not move into encouraging these young men to become more adaptive and successful in partnering, or that the self does not claim them as their longing, that it can go to some place that is very dark and very, very destructive. So I'm wondering if we can just take a minute to really appreciate the pathology of loneliness when it isn't resolved. And I'm wondering if you guys have ever seen that in your practice.
What I'm going back to, Joseph, is when you were talking about your own loneliness in your 20s and you mentioned impatience and anger. And I think that, that's maybe the nub of it. It's the sense of, the thing about being alone and lonely in your 20s or 30s or something during this Ericksonian stage of intimacy versus isolation is if you don't find that intimacy, it's sort of like in some way you're kind of shut out from life. You don't get the good thing that other people are getting. And for some people, this is, I want to have kids. And if you don't find a partner, that's harder to do. But not everyone wants kids. That's not the only thing you might be shut out from. But there is this sense that everyone's getting it. Everyone's getting paired off and you're not. And
Mm-hmm.
that anger can either be the fire we were talking about before, or it can turn into resentment. I just looked up the etymology for resentment because I do think that that's the key to what you're talking about with the incel movement,
Mm-hmm.
that's the poison is resentment. And one of the, if you look at the etymology, one of the kind of core meanings is to feel again. And it's this idea, I like that because it's this idea of how anger can kind of recur back again on itself into kind of like a never-ending loop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it doesn't go anywhere. It just becomes a kind of worm that burrows deeper and deeper in your heart and means that you just feel done wrong.
It's a kind of fatalism that
Yeah.
that's inevitable. They actually even have a term for it in the community, which I've actually heard this from clients who actually have pulled themselves out of it. They call it the black pill.
Hmm.
And the idea that there is a kind of biological factor that means that unattractive people will never be accepted by women as viable spouses, and they are doomed to this chronic, frustrated rage. And that there is nothing that they can do other than take some kind of pleasure in churning that with each other.
I really think this is such an important point. I'm glad you introduced this, Joseph, of that loneliness can become such a pathology. And it may be that if one is lonely, it really does need to act as a spur to one's own self growth. Because if you really feel that it's the external world that has been unyielding or depriving, and you've been hard done by, that seems to me to be the core of this kind of resentment and pathological loneliness, because you don't have any control over it. It's been done to you. It's out there, and it's hopeless. You have no control over it. Versus saying, "Wait a minute, I need to do something about this."
And it's also defensive because you're saying, well, it's hopeless. And so then you don't risk anything, right? You can just, like you said, Joseph, sort of churn with others on the internet, but you never have to expose yourself to the vulnerability of reaching out for connection.
And that brings us perhaps full circle to the idea of the self-perpetuating jalopy, that, there's this very marginalized way of coping with life, but one would have to risk giving that up in order to tolerate being penetrated by intimacy.
Yes. Opening oneself up to something larger.
And all of the anxiety and unsureness of breaking into the closed system. And the incel communities are apparently highly closed systems, that people who are perceived of as being successful or attractive are alienated, and people who try to escape it are also alienated. When I've seen young men who were deeply involved in the incel community and they're coming out of that, by the way, sometimes they call that taking the red pill, which is interesting. The blackness of passivity, the black pill, versus the red pill, the calcinatio. I don't think that's verbalized in the community, but I think of that. That the red pill, is this idea of being capable of adapting to reality and waking up and having enough fire to ask this question of, what would I need to develop to be an attractive mate or partner, whether it's social skills or personal grooming or all the other numerous very complicated things that people need to bring into the social dimension, rather than believing in the fatalism. And this is a reference to that movie, The Matrix, where the hero is, brought into this moment, and they can take one pill in which they'll fall asleep and be returned to the matrix and the illusion of life as it is, or they could take the other pill, which allows them to wake up to reality, which might be really difficult and even frightening, but at least they'll be awake.
Yes, and empowered to have their fate in their own hands.
So I think that loneliness in one way is very natural and developmental, but in another way it can be a toxic dynamic that I think has been underappreciated. Jordan Peterson cries out around this issue from time to time, talking about the alienation and toxic loneliness of young men. And, sometimes he says things that are provocative in terms of
He
young men,
does.
reaching out and being more integrated into the, community of relationships. But I think he is giving a voice to the helplessness that young men have. And I do hear this, that they are lonely and they don't know what the magic formula is to be found acceptable and to be received. And I think that is part of the larger question of male initiation and the larger question of helping, or how do we help, in this case, young men, learn how to adapt successfully to the culture. And frankly, I don't think spending 10 hours a day gaming prepares you well.
No, but perhaps those issues of gaming and male initiation, Joseph, those are such rich topics in and of themselves, and perhaps we can do an episode on those later. But for now, I'm wondering if we might transition to a dream.
I think it's time. So our dreamer today is a 41-year-old mother who works at home. And here's the dream. I dreamt I was haphazardly packing up my family's things after a stay at a friend's house. In the bathroom, I find I have my period and have bled through all my cloth pads. My underwear is soaked and bright red. I am overwhelmed by the color and amount of blood. Could I use their washing machine, I wonder? After some thought, I decide to make a pad with toilet paper. Then I head upstairs looking for my husband and kids. Going up, I remember that we considered buying this house once, but decided it was too big and needed too much work. It's beautiful now. I go upstairs to the attic. There are deep, rich rugs and walls in browns and reds, quiet tables and chairs. It feels good. High ceilings, 30 feet, but the space is still warm and encompassing. My family is here. I see the kids' bunk bed to the left. In front of me is a huge window with a view of an enormous maple tree in full red color. It is astonishing, such beauty, leaves rustling. Talking with my husband, I recall how when we last saw this place, it was derelict, holes in the roof, floorboards missing, pipes exposed, a real mess. The transformation is incredible. I think of the work and expense it was to bring those windows up. I love this place. To the left, there's another huge window split in 3 sections and shows a long view across plains to distant mountains. We are shockingly high. The view is beautiful, but suddenly I feel dizzy. I'm afraid of heights and need to sit down. My son is fooling around near the windows. I tell myself he's fine, but I'm still afraid. Are the windows sound? I tell myself he'll be fine, my husband is with him, but can't tolerate the feeling. I head for the stairs down. And this dreamer also says that she's been at home with her children for 12 years and that they're all about to attend school next year. And that 2 years ago there was a synchronicity and she had some contact with her animus and is going to be returning to the artistic practice she had before she had children. Well, I'm aware of all the red color in this dream.
Yes.
The repeated image of red is really marked.
Mm-hmm. Right, because we had the red pad, and she said she was overwhelmed by the color. And then we also had the browns and reds in the rugs and walls. And then there was also the enormous maple tree in full red color. So something is really, we were talking about red pills before and also kind of fiery stuff. There's a lot of red in this dream. What do we make of that? What do we make of the color red?
In this dream, the redness is associated with the end of things, where sometimes red can be associated with the beginning of things. So when I think about the primacy of the menstruation, if we look at it in a purely biological level, that a woman menstruates because she has not been inseminated. It's actually proof that the opportunity to be inseminated has passed, and the uterus is sloughing off the preparation to be fertile as part of the cycle of perhaps returning to another fertile phase, which is very similar with the leaves turning red on the trees. It's the dropping away, the end of a season of growth and fertility. and that she's attending to that and orienting to it successfully. So at this admission that fertilization has not occurred, then she transitions into what I think of, frankly, as a highly idealized image of house and home.
Hmm.
And if we use the if-then question, how is this confrontation of the missed opportunity to be fertilized then lead to the idealization of home and family? And I think there's a message in that to me.
Well, it does seem, I agree that there are endings and that menstruation and fall leaves, although they're beautiful, signify the end of a season.
Mm-hmm.
And she also says in the context that next year her children will all be in school and she wants to return to her artistic practice. And I'm not sure, I think the house is maybe more complicated as a symbol. There is a certain idealization, but there's also a certain amount of spaciousness that she says we decided it was too big and needed too much work when they once considered buying the house, but it's beautiful now. And I think there may be some hints of a new season beginning and a larger space that could be exciting and containing. And then at the end, a little scary. Is it safe? My son is playing near the windows.
So what my intuition about this dreamer, and of course I'm just making this up, but sort of pinging off what you're saying, Deb, is that this seems like the dream of someone who has allowed their life to stay small in the interest of safety, but is being called to open up life a bit more and live in a larger way, and that's frightening. And so we get that in like the house, it's like, oh no, it's too big for us. But then really it's, wow, I love it. I love this house. This would have maybe been okay to expand, to think more expansively. And then this idea of being very, very high up, which I think is an interesting image because there's something about being high up that gives us perspective. We can sort of see far. We can see far and wide. We have a larger sense of things. For me, it tracks with this thing that Jung said about we don't solve our problems, we grow larger than them. And that quote is embedded in this larger passage where he talks about sort of getting up above life's problems and seeing them from a different perspective. And it's like here, this dream kind of, says, there's a possibility for this here. But, it's frightening. It's frightening to her. Joseph, I love what you did there, linking the period and is it a maple tree? I think that's really right on. And in between there, I'll share another thing. I'm not sure what to do with it, but there's a deep, rich rug and walls in browns and reds. Feels good. High ceilings, but the space is warm and encompassing. To me, that sounds very womb-like.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of red and brown room that's warm and encompassing. So somewhere in there's perhaps a kind of image of a womb, of a place to gestate something new.
And I'm also so aware that what was once an impossible purchase, it was too big and it needed too much work, forget it, now is beautiful.
Mm.
And it seems almost as if the house itself has grown, just in the dream. They didn't do anything to it, but somehow the house has grown. And she says, my family is here. And then Psyche comes along with, after all this wonderful transformation, with, oh my goodness, we're awfully high up. I've always been afraid of heights.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the new beginning that she's thinking about is both exciting to return to her artistic practice and scary.
Mm-hmm.
So if I think that sounds all true.
And yes.
But I'm also thinking about the dream as a kind of medicine, that it's something the psyche needs to hear. So what I would just add to that is that if the home is symbolic of the idea of returning to the artistic practice that she had put down. I'm wondering if the artistic practice has become so reified, has become so glorious in her imagination, that it is a kind of dizzying height, and that this feeling that there's something problematic about it being so big, so beautiful, so sumptuous, and that the psyche is pulling her back from the ledge of that and perhaps trying to ground her expectations into being a little bit more realistic, or doing a little bit more of a risk benefit analysis, not to stop her from living in the great big house of her artistic aspirations, but perhaps from making them seem overly grand to compensate for the fact that her womb feels barren.
So, Joseph, you're hearing idealization and kind of inflation in this dream. And I think that
Mhm.
that is certainly one way to look at it, sort of almost a little bit of a kind of warning. So if we were to go with that, we would say, that the dream is reflecting back to the ego, that something's been sort of overvalued, let's say. Something's not really kind of grounded. I mean, this incredible transformation that the house has been through, it's sort of like, well, how did that happen? That was magic.
Mhm.
I agree that that is one way to read this dream, and yet intuitively, I think I'm going in this other direction, that the dream is reflecting to the dreamer the ego attitude. So this is something that dreams will sometimes do, is just say, oh, look, here's how you're consciously orienting to something. And reading it that way, it would be like, look, this new place, now that there's a barren womb, this new place that you're in is actually full of promise and beauty. But you, dream ego, you, conscious personality, have a really hard time sitting with that, and you tend to pull away from this because it almost makes you nervous.
Mhm. She says in the associations that this approach to returning to the artistic practice is exciting and enlivening, but also deeply challenging and frightening.
Hmm.
So I think the dream, of course, is holding both those values. But I'm also interested that when we think about the fear as being something about the sun fooling around near the window
Hmm.
and wanting to retreat to the son, to the husband rather, taking care of him, I'm wondering if that image we can derive some insight about the nature of her fear as
Hmm.
it's symbolized as in taking care of the son.
Hmm.
That could be useful to her.
Yeah. So one of the things I might do if I had this person here is I say, well, so I would ask, what is the concern about the windows? Right.
Yeah,
Because, if you think about it, if you're up in a very high room, let's say, and you're kind of goofing around near the windows, I guess the danger would be that you would land against the windows with such force that you would break them and then fall out.
that's what she says.
Which,
She says, "Are the
yes,
windows sound?"
or the windows sound. And what we might imagine is, in most cases in the sort of normal world, unless you were doing something rather extreme, you're not going to fall through the window,
Mhm.
right? So there doesn't the dream in sort of objectively, if you just look at the image, there doesn't really seem to be any danger, right?
Exactly.
But Joseph, you're asking this question, sort of, what about the son? I would be so curious about how old the son is
Mhm.
and what the son is doing that he's fooling around. Because, of course, children in dreams can refer to, our relationships with actual children, but it can also refer to that young part of ourselves. And, if kids, when they're fooling around, they're being playful. So maybe she's feeling a call to reclaim a sort of playful attitude as she moves into this next stage of her life. But it makes her nervous. Perhaps she's had to live her life in such a way that she's vigilant, that she's kind of hyper vigilant and always on the lookout for danger. and that has constrained her in some ways.
And I think that it goes hand in glove with being a mother of young children. Your world is small. Your world is keeping an eye on toddlers and little kids, and safety, protection, nurturing, a safe container in a home. I sense the ambivalence in the dream here of, I want this. I love this house. It's really beautiful. Look at this amazing transformation. And then the fear, is it going to be safe? We're up awfully high.
So I'm feeling that the thing that might not be safe is that as she is approaching the return to her artistic practice and the fullness and promise of that, it also causes her to examine what her life has been like in the previous 12 years and to contain the negative feelings of that. So I think that the beauty of the house, the rich rugs, the 30-foot ceilings, the kids are there, maple tree is all very beautiful, but that's juxtaposed with what it was like for her in the previous 12 years, which is the last time she looked at the house of her artistic life. It looked like it was derelict with holes in the floor and the roof and floorboards missing and pipes exposed in a real mess. And we could imagine that the cause of that real mess is the little son who's fooling around by the window. And I'm wondering if part of the anxiety she might be feeling is that she has a sense of resentment and anger and a feeling of the cost to her soul in being a mother, and that admitting that to herself and metabolizing it is part of the journey to reclaim her identity as an artist.
I was thinking that the image of the sun playing near the windows is her young animus. And she says in her comments that she had a synchronous experience a couple of years ago with her animus, but that here's a young animus. And is it safe? Is he trustworthy? It's a very, unsure kind of place, and that's what it's going to take for her to restart her artistic career, is a more inward, self-generative kind of process versus what she's spent the last 12 years doing, which is being conscious of other people.
Yeah, I mean, Joseph, I like you sort of picking up what the house looked like before. And my hunch is that doesn't speak to the way her life looked in the period of time that she was home with her kids, but probably referred to her psyche, maybe, sort of once she reached adulthood. Like, we might wonder maybe if there had been some trauma or other hardship in this person's life that now we're looking at the possibility of it being substantially healed.
So I can recognize, Lisa, the telos, that even if the house was derelict previously, and that may have been a symbol for me about her artistic life being or falling into decay because her libido was going into tending something else in her life. And I think parents make tremendous sacrifices for their families and for their children, and willing sacrifices. But I still imagine that as she returns to an artistic practice that has been put on hold for 12 years, that she will have to face the fact that it's been put on 12 years hold, and that had an impact on her.
Well, and the other thing is that the feeling that comes up around the sun is one of care and concern, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going to Deb's point about it being a kind of perhaps an image of a young animus energy, which the animus for me in a woman often seems to speak to the woman's creative life in my experience. And so here's a new creative connection with creative energy that the ego feels is precarious. The ego is not sure that it's going to be safe. And so there's a sense of wanting to ensure that it is safe. And to me, this dream, I see it as fairly positive, saying, it's really okay. You can sort of trust this. It's going to be okay, even though it's difficult to tolerate that degree of anxiety right now.
I can see that. But I find myself thinking about there's a Freudian defense called undoing.
Hmm.
Undoing, which is that when an unacceptable feeling rises up in the ego, that it will defensively manifest its opposite.
Yes.
So I still am wondering if the dreamer or the dream ego is actually feeling rather negatively towards the sun and then generates an undoing and then a display of kind of concern and worry. But I think the anxiety is that it's hard for her to admit how resentful or how negative she feels about the role of sacrifice and the role of mothering when she stands in the face of revitalizing her artistic career. And I don't think of that as a negative thing to face, by the way. I don't think this is a criticism of the
Yeah.
dreamer. I think that that is the fertile field out of which the new house is resurrected.
Well, I mean, you could be right. I am feeling, however, I have a different feeling take on this dream,
I do
and
too.
I think you're coming at it from a place that just isn't resonating with me on a feeling level. And also, I don't see evidence of it in the dream, Joseph, that she's resentful of her children. I just don't see that in the dream. I mean, we can come up with this idea about undoing, but it seems like to me, that feels like we're working real hard to kind of manufacture this experience of resentment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't a career she put down, it was a practice. Now we don't have any idea what that meant, but it's not like she was, on her way to being a world famous opera singer and then set it aside to have kids. There isn't this sense of we don't know what the cost was, but it's
But I want to come back to just the last phrase, which is I tell myself he'll be fine. My husband is with him, but can't tolerate the feeling. So there are
mhm.
feelings that she's having a hard time tolerating.
Yes, and I think it's anxiety.
It could be anxiety, but she knows she's anxious.
Mhm.
But if she really can't tolerate something, what's hidden? And people often feel anxious when they're having feelings that the ego finds dystonic or not permissible. And I think actually, Lisa, you can speak well to this with all of your research on mothering, that the shadow and the light of mothering have to come together to create the fertile field for the heart
Mhm.
and for the
Mhm.
relationship with the child. And if we keep collapsing into this idealization in the dream, it deprives her of the underbelly of it all.
Well, I think this is a really interesting process as I've been listening to, hopefully to all of us. And maybe what we can take from it is the richness that our different points of view and our different life experiences, both Lisa and I are mothers, and that we do infuse the dreams with our own perspectives, points of view, life experiences, and we project some of that
Mhm.
into the material. This is a great illustration of how differently
Yes.
we can react to a dream and kind of highlight different facets of it. And I'm hoping that the dreamer, as ever, select what may be useful to her.
Mhm.
There are going to
Mhm.
be some things, just like in a session, that resonate, and the person in the room says, that's it, bingo. And then there are other times that the person in the session says, I really don't feel like we're on the right track. So that's part of our process here, I think, in exploring and circumambulating a dream image. And we'll leave it to the dreamer, I think, to see what fits for her.
Indeed.
Yes.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.